Hi everyone, my name is Vasish Ganesh. My group members are Albert Liu and Manuj Marwaha, and together we're going to do our presentation on interior Chinatown. So the way we decided to structure our presentation, instead of the traditional excerpts or pieces of the text, we decided to structure it by character instead of by page number or something like that. So the way we did it is we took the three main characters of the text and each one of us took to analyzing one of them. So the three main characters are Willis Wu, the narrator, and that's who I'll be analyzing. Then after that, Albert will analyze Sifu, or in other words, old Asian man. And Manuj will do the older brother. So, Willis Wu. What I find most interesting about Willis Wu is that he's not really defined by his character traits or his personality. That's not what's really striking about Willis Wu or is very important to the novel at all. He's kind of just there in the background telling the story. What's interesting about Willis Wu is his very unique perception of the world. And it's through that unique perception or that lens that we see the rest of interior Chinatown, essentially. And that essentially is what drives the plot and makes it so interesting because of how he thinks of these so-called mundane events or these people. His views are what make it interesting, what lend the story life. And that's why I think he's so important, even though he's not really a character in the traditional sense. So the first thing I like to call to attention is Willis's 5-tier hierarchy system. So in this hierarchy system, he classifies himself as a background Oriental male, and that's the lowest on the hierarchy system. After that, he's got dead Asian male, then he's got generic Asian male number 3, generic Asian male number 2, and generic Asian male number 1. And then on top of all of those, right, where generic Asian male number 1 is the top, right, he's got one more. And he says that if somebody in the generic Asian male number 1 category gets lucky enough, maybe they'll get recognized and move up to this new special category. And essentially that's based on their knowledge of Kung Fu. And the reason he says this is that he thinks that's the only way to be recognized by the so-called black and white. And that's essentially Hollywood. And to some extent, he's correct. Most of the famous Chinese actors have to do with martial arts. And in this case, he's talking about Kung Fu. But it's interesting that he paints the picture that the only way to be successful as an Asian male is through Kung Fu. Now, granted, he may be right, as that may be the only way to be successful in Hollywood, but he thinks that every Asian male, will dream of becoming some sort of Kung Fu master, even though that's not the only path to success, which is, I find to be a little bit of a narrow worldview, but also a very interesting one. Because there's so many paths to success. Like, you could do software, you could found a company. There's many ways to do it. Yet, Willis Wu is adamant that this is the true way or the best path to success. So another thing I wanted to note is Willis's very rigid view on the father-son relationship. And that's really emphasized when Willis starts to talk about Sifu. So Willis always has seen the father-son relationship to go one way and one way only. That is, the father is the dominant presence. He's the one who takes care of his son. He's the one who stands up, he's tall, he's the big person of the family, essentially. He's the rock. And he thinks that anything else is shameful, right? Any deterioration or change in this relationship is something to be ashamed of. And that's why he talks about how he tries to hide it when Sifu gets old, and hence, instead of the father taking care of the son now has to take care of the elderly father. It's very interesting that Willis, instead of seeing this as a natural phenomenon, right, it happens to like in almost every family. Eventually, once the elders get old enough, the younger generation will have to take care of them. But he sees this as almost abhorrent or even shameful, and as a result of that, he tries to hide it. Right? He'll talk about how he'll go to Kung Fu lessons with Sifu as a pretense, just to drop off supplies and food so that Sifu can live comfortably and properly. All right. The final thing I want to talk about is to do with the elder brother, and Willis here makes a distinction between a myth and a legend, which I find to be very interesting. And the way he does this is he brings up Bruce Lee, and he says that Bruce Lee is a legend. The reason is Bruce Lee is the legend. So Bruce Lee is the person that everybody looks up to, right? He's the person that everybody adores, they fall at the feet of Bruce Lee. They worship them, essentially. And he says that that's because of his martial arts, right? A lot of kids, even whether they're Chinese or not, have grown up seeing Bruce Lee do these amazing fight scenes, and that's why everybody literally worships Bruce Lee. And instead of that, he says the older brother is a little different. Instead of being a legend, he's a myth, right? He's the person that everybody wants to grow up to be because he's kind, he's funny, he's insanely talented, he can do all these amazing things. But unlike Bruce Lee, he's not widely known. He's not a legend. And the reason he draws this distinction is that he says that in order for somebody who's Asian, like for say elder brother, to become a legend, they need to make a compromise. Essentially, they can't be truly Asian and also be a legend. And he's saying that Bruce Lee made this compromise too. So he's saying that in order to be a legend, he'd have to compromise his kung fu. He'd have to make it essentially not really the true martial art that has like thousands of years of history behind it. Instead of staying true to that, he'd have to just make it a bunch of pow 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 flashy moves, right? And to lose the true intrinsic value of the Asian spirit of kung fu. And that's where he says that creates essentially a glass ceiling. In order to break that glass ceiling, he has to lose his Asian identity. So to keep the Asian identity, it's not possible to go as high in success as somebody else. And that's also that actually allows us to tie to Cheng, actually. So Cheng talks about this same idea in Melancholy of Race, right? And the central question of that work is there any getting over race, right? And this would again seem to agree with Cheng and say, no, there is no getting over race. No matter how hard you try, you can't break that glass ceiling without destroying your own identity.
Hi, so I'll be in this section of Interior Chinatown. I'll be talking about the section detailing Old Asian Man, which is talking about the degradation of Sifu, or Willis Wu's master. Okay, so basically in this section, Willis describes that his master Sifu was just mostly an old Asian man. He's no longer the man he used to be, with like the young man with like all the vigor, with all the pants and muscles and the look in his eye. Like all of that is gone now, and that in addition, when Willis first showed up to the door one day for like a weekly lesson, he actually Sifu doesn't actually recognize him for like a good solid like minute, which signals like an oncoming of dementia or some sort of uh, premature memory loss. And this just shows that he's aging and no longer was the man he used to be. The author also talks about basically like what has changed. So the traditional like father-son relationship, master-student relationship has been reversed in this situation, and this is and as well as the quality of life of Sifu, as well as his looks. And then what the author actually argues is this is what I believe to be the transition to be from Chinese to American ways, in that like aging is the catalyst for that. And then I'll be also be connecting it to Ahmad's post-colonial theory and its possible like reversion. Okay, so basically the first topic that he brings up is the father-son relationship. So traditionally, right, he states that like in Asian culture that like father is always supposed to look out for his son and like no matter what. But in American cultures, um, when the father is when the child is young, the father will take care of the child. But when the father turns old, he'll actually the son will actually take care of the father. And then, but in like Chinese culture, this states that this like father-son relationship of the father taking care of the son should always like remain the same, or like will always remain the same. And then this is shown through a specific text. So in one line he says, "I'm sorry, I can't reach," and in the other line he says, "Oh, it's okay, ba," which means father in Chinese. I got it. And then the apologies, the true sign that this was not the man you once knew, a man who would never have uttered that word to his son, sorry, in English no less. Not because he thought himself infallible, but because his belief that a family should never have to say sorry or please or thank you. So basically, he's saying that the traditional like family structure and like the father-son relationship and the parent-son relationship in Chinese culture is shattered. And so now he's transitioned to a more of an American style relationship where since like Sifu is older now, like the son has to take care of the father or the master in this case. And then another thing that the author talks about is called the quality of life or the spending on poverty attribute of this section. Okay, so basically, um, he says that Sifu is like nowadays he's basically like stretching the dollar for each week. Like for example, in one paragraph he says, which equals stretching the dollar for that week, boiled chicken bones for twice for a watery soup. Basically, getting using less and less money, or like uh, becoming like closer and closer to poverty. And then he also like another paragraph details that he's actually living like paycheck to paycheck, uh, sometimes over like going overdue on some bills. And this I can actually relate this to Chinese culture as well. So I believe that generally it's in my household, in like in Asian culture as well, we tend to like save more than Americans. So like, and I find this like applicable to Asians as a whole. So, and Americans tend to not that they like spend everything they can, but they tend to use money more and have like enjoy the pleasures of life instead of saving it all and like using it wisely. And then so like before he was probably actually like saving and like using it wisely, but in this case he's actually living paycheck to paycheck, which a lot of Americans do. And then this can be like the catalyst. This is due to this shift from like Chinese values to like American values is what the author explains like is aging. Aging is a catalyst for it. And the last thing I wanted to present is the looks. So basically, there's a common stereotype that Asians probably look like always look younger than they do, or like always look younger for their age than their like European or white counterparts. And this is actually has like a grain of truth in it, due to like the melanin content in your skin, as well as like sunlight exposure, as well as like societal expectations of beauty, and as well as like facial structure, which leads to uh, you looking Asians looking younger you than like white people normally do. And but one contrast to this is that when Asians turn old, they actually look relatively the same to their white counterparts. Like they have like the same sags and like the same wrinkles in their skin, and so like we can see that aging, what he argues, is like the catalyst from Chinese to American values, or like from looking younger to looking the same. So this is just a little detail or like a little thing in his this excerpt that I found pretty interesting, so I just made the connection to there. And then the last thing I wanted to connect it with was Ahmad's post-colonial theory. So basically, that Ahmad in his work of post-colonialism is that he says that third world countries generally want to actually um, kind of follow the first world's examples. Like in like many Asian countries, they always follow American fashions, right? Like I know in China, they follow a lot of trends, and like sometimes they speak like certain like English words, or like follow fashion trends. So basically, this is third world uh, third world. Sorry, first world customs in third world countries. But actually, in here we actually see a reversal of that, which I find pretty interesting. So like in this case, it's like third world immigrants and customs brought to a first world country. So basically, he's saying that since this reversion has happened, it's like they want to keep their cultures, and like it's like the complete opposite of of the situation that Ahmad is arguing, and like I found that pretty interesting. So thank you for coming to my presentation. Thank you. See you next time.
Older brother is a symbol, a representation for something that feels achievable for the people in Chinatown. This is why he's not considered a legend, but a myth. Reading on, he seems to become the goal for others. Something realistic. As stated on page 25, Bruce Lee was the guy you worshipped. Older brother was the guy you dreamt of growing up to be. And this kind of drove my analysis. Older brother's good hair, kung fu, height, respect, and even SAT scores reflect an ideal kind of person. And yet, as the plot unfolds, he has a sudden downfall. Almost like a denial of the potential of poor Chinese people to ever reach this level. This communicates a dark message about the American dream. The illusion of growing as high as possible, but then realizing that you are ultimately limited by your background. And this kind of reminded me of the green flashing light from The Great Gatsby. Something that was just out of reach, but just disastrously unattainable. It's like hitting a glass door or ceiling. You believe confidently that you can go further, but then you're suddenly stopped. The dream of Chinese American assimilation is halted. And in the final paragraph, we observe that he even mentions it as uncomfortable, giving it an out of place kind of feel. So, ultimately, this struggle in both characterization and attaining certain ideals leads to a deeper discussion of whether the tangible is always the best and highest standard. And although older brother felt closer to the minds of Chinatown, unlike Bruce Lee, he is flawed and fails to escape his background. He faces a crushing reality, bringing the vision of growth back to Earth. This may be the reason why, historically, humans have worshipped multiple higher powers, like God. He's a concept that illustrates the perfect values that all should uphold, and the reward of doing so. We look up to other people, but every person has their own flaws. In this case, older brother seemed to be almost flawless, but was held back by the system he was born into and thrived in. But this too is problematic. Trying to become perfect is an impossible task, and we need someone to guide us or set an example. Perhaps this is why older brother's defeat is so tragic. This excerpt as a whole also relates to Chang's The Melancholy of Race. It presents racial grief as a result of societal constructs and is something that is impossible to escape. And this is clearly observed here, as reflected in the discomfort surrounding the father-son relationship and the very existence of an older brother type character. Despite all efforts, race once again presents itself as the impossible, the impassable obstacle. And in doing so, eliminates the prospects of assimilation for these Chinese Americans.